I was very lucky yesterday to see a documentary by Mexican filmmaker Everardo Gonzalez, and it's a film called Devil's Freedom. I suppose you would say this is a documentary about the disappearances of people on both sides of the drug war in Mexico. The subject matter isn't particularly new. We've all seen films, documentaries and Netflix series about issues such as the Mexican drug cartels. He gets some remarkable interviews with people both within the drug cartels themselves, within the military, and obviously he talks to some of the families of those people who've disappeared. Basically, on both sides of the law, lawlessness reigns. The currency for survival is simply staying alive. It takes a really unique approach to first-hand testimony. Having seen many documentaries about this subject, this particular film really struck a chord, not least because of a curious device that the filmmaker uses with all of his interviewees. Now, when you're making documentaries, and I've made a few in the past, one of the really tricky elements of doing sort of sensitive subjects is to somehow conceal your interviewee in a way that isn't just a silhouette against a window. This director uses a very curious technique of effectively putting a mask over the faces of every single one of his contributors and interviewees. They are all wearing these curious, almost bandage-like masks. They reminded me somewhat of the masks that wrestlers wear, or Mexican wrestlers wear, but devoid of any sort of colour, so they look more like bandages. It was a bit like Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And at first you would have thought this would distance you somewhat from the interviewees and from what they were saying. Their stories were so compelling and so moving and so heart-wrenching from both sides of the divide, if you like, that these sort of strangely bandaged, slightly sort of mannequin-like faces slowly made you realise that you were listening to what they were saying in a completely different way. You could see their eyes, you could see their nose, the tip of their nose, and you could see their mouth. And somehow this didn't get in the way of the shock and horror of what was being said and the emotional urgency of what was being said. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it amplified it. The only actual interesting giveaway signs of any emotion were when some of the contributors cried. You would see a moistness creep in around here, or, you know, obviously from where the tears fell down around their nose, there'd be a bit of moistness here. So it was an odd device, incredibly haunting, incredibly chilling, and incredibly effective, whether it be the mother of children who had gone missing, a man who'd been abducted by a gang and abused and raped and tortured, the daughters of a mother who'd been abducted, members of the military who felt as trapped within the military as the gang members felt within the drug gangs, to gang members who talked about the act of killing. And yet at the same time you were reminded that yes, even the killers were humans without choice, humans without any prospects, humans without any sort of likely dignity, and that they found some kind of meaning in the process of killing. What the masks managed to do for me was they managed to kind of equalize everyone's experiences. So you were forced back from judging the killers, because when you talk to the military, who are supposedly the good guys, they too were involved in the act of torturing and killing people. Everyone was fighting for their own survival, and in a weird way that's where the title Devil's Freedom comes from. Freedom only came at a price. They had to sell, you know, their soul quite literally to the devil. They were talking about the value of a life at one point being nothing more than $10. In order to sort of stay alive within the military, with each person you killed, you'd effectively earn about $10. And there was one guy who was talking from the military, and there was one guy who was in the army, and he was saying that when he said he wanted to stop doing this, the military actually threatened to find him, seek him down and destroy him if he did this. So there was a very compelling sense of all people being trapped within this web of self-sustaining violence that was supposed to buy them some kind of freedom. As I was sitting there, and I was reminded of films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with Leatherface with his face covered up, and Halloween, and even Friday the 13th with the hockey masks. This idea of masking what was going on underneath was both chilling, but also it managed to kind of equalize and make everyone's experience somehow equivalent. But it also reminded me that they were all really the living dead. There was no one here who was sustaining themselves beyond the routine and the cycle of killing and killing and killing. And interestingly, when the two killers actually talked in graphic detail about the act of actually shooting families, shooting children, their first killings, and the feeling of adrenaline and rush that came with it, and the sense of belonging and sort of respect that was gained from the rest of the gang. They talked very eloquently and movingly about the way in which, upon that first killing, they felt that they died. And then that was interestingly contrasted with the experiences of two girls whose mother and family had been abducted. And when asked the question, what would they like to do to the killers, they had no forgiveness. They were happy, understandably, to want to mete out the same violence to the abductors of their mother. In documentary terms, it was beautifully made. It was very low key. Very unusually, the sound design and the music was absolutely stunning. So if you see it, do pay attention to those moments between the interviews, because they're not exploiting dramatic tension. They're not trying to ratchet up the drama. It's a very sit back and let the subject matter just really wash over you in the most horrific way. And you have these very odd scenes where you would have sort of everyday life, where people would be working in factories, or families would be sort of sitting around in their lounges. And with this mask technique, it was like a sort of Walking Dead situation, but of course they're the living dead, getting on with their lives, no one wanting to be identified, everyone needing to conceal their identities, and everyone sort of connected by this muted, bandaged, strangely constrained existence. These scenes of day-to-day life were really quite chilling. You know, it kind of made you think that really all of their dreams, all of their hopes were strangely bandaged up. Weirdly, through its masking of facial emotions and your inability to see the details of the face, there was enough there with the eyes and the mouth and just the composure of people to make this probably one of the most emotional documentaries I think I've ever seen. It's a tough watch. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's about a subject, as I say, we've seen many sort of dramatic renderings of on Netflix. We all feel we've seen a drama about it, and we all like to watch those dramas. But I think for anyone who likes things like Narcos and Sicario and those sorts of films, this is a much-needed jolt of reality in order to kind of better understand the many different sides of a war that's cost tens of thousands of lives. And in fact, I think more people have died in the Mexican drug cartel wars than have died in the Iraqi Gulf Wars. The expressionless nature of their faces takes this film into true horror territory. It's a sort of blank, empty, numbing distance that kicks in. Your heart goes out to all of these contributors, and I have to say, including the killers themselves, though of course any human, you're sitting there looking at them thinking, some of the things they describe they've done, you think, how on earth do you stay alive? How on earth do you keep breathing? If this film hasn't won any awards, it deserves to win some awards.